checks and balances, what financial reform means to you. And today the question we're going to tackle is whether the Fed can spark small business. I am Connell McShane, and today for Cheryl Casoni. With me for the entire hour are Jim Awad, Managing Director at Zephyr Management, and our very own Sandra Smith. And joining us to assess the state of small business lending, former SBA Administrator Hector V. Barreto, and Lloyd Chapman is also with us, President of the American Small Business League. But I do want to start with Peter Barnes, who's at the Fed's Small Business Lending Conference today down there in D.C. What can the Fed do, I wonder, Peter?
Well, hey, Connell, everybody here is focused on small business because everybody's looking at small business to create jobs in this economic recovery, which, as you know, is not happening very much, particularly with small companies worried about the future, healthcare reform, lending, and everything else that's going on out there. Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke kicking off things this morning, talking about everything that the Fed has done already to try and help improve small business lending, and also looking at potential steps down the road. Some of the problems he talked about here, clearly there might be a lack of demand. It might be that simple. Companies may not want to borrow right now. It also could be due to tighter lending standards and tough bank examinations. But the Fed chairman did have a little bit of analysis to share with these conference members. Take a listen.
Some of the lenders that participated in our meetings expressed the view that current lending conditions don't represent credit tightening as much as a return to more traditional underwriting standards following a period where standards were too lax.
Okay, so a return to normal is one of the reasons potentially that small businesses aren't getting enough loans. But we have a chart, I think, that shows what's been going on with commercial and industrial lending at the biggest banks that the Fed oversees here. And it's a really ugly picture, down 25% in the financial crisis, a drop of $200 billion in lending, a lot of that to small and mid-sized companies. Connell?
Yeah, absolutely, Peter. You stay with us. You might want to respond to what some of our guests have to say on this. It's a huge issue. We do have former SBA Administrator Hector V. Barreto with us, Chairman of the Latino Coalition. Lloyd Chapman also here, President of the American Small Business League. Let me start with you, Hector, on this question of what is not being done now that could be done to help small business in your estimation?
Well, I think small businesses need a lot of things. Obviously, capital is critically important. And I think you touched on it in the beginning. There are some small businesses that can get loans that don't want the loans because they don't have enough business. Also, what we're hearing from a lot of the community banks is they feel like they get it from both sides. You know, the administration sometimes says you're not doing enough, and on the other side, the regulators are saying you're doing too much. Don't do any more of the kind of lending that you've been doing. Right. So it's a tricky situation. But I will tell you that, you know, the perception does become reality. And a lot of small businesses are really concerned about the future. They don't know where this recovery is going, and they don't know how to plan for the future.
And they're worried about their costs going up and all these types of things.
Sure.
But from your point of view, Lloyd, let me go to Lloyd now. Is it too much being done or not enough being done? Which side of that argument would you come down on?
Well, small businesses create close to 100% of all net new jobs in America. And so far, they've received maybe 5% of stimulus funds. So I think the government's not doing enough. In fact, I don't think anyone thinks they're doing too much. And quite frankly, all the surveys of small business have shown that they're not looking for loans, they're looking for contracts. And the Obama administration is taking most of the money that's supposed to be going to small businesses and directing to large businesses. So I don't think lending is really the solution.
That's interesting, because that would change the discussion a little bit. I'm going to let Jim and Sandra jump in here with the guests in a moment. But just back to you quickly, Peter, that would change the discussion a little bit about if the Fed is doing more on the lending side of it, and maybe, you know, to Lloyd's point, maybe that's not the issue that should be focused on. I don't know.
Yeah, that's right. If you look at some of the surveys, for example, from the National Federation of Independent Business, which is here today, by the way, participating in this conference, the #1 issue for its members is a better economic recovery, more business. So whether that's coming from contracts, whether that's coming from new sales, they say, according to these surveys, that's the #1 issue. Getting financing is way down in the list of issues, like number 5 or 6 or something.
Jim, you want to jump in?
Yeah, well,
either Lloyd or Hector
sort of we're talking about two things, the availability of credit and the demand for loans. And the bears say that the U.S. economy is slowing down and that people don't want to borrow, that they're afraid of any leverage in this economic environment.
So the demand is not there.
The demand is not there, and I'd like to hear from advocates, people who speak for small business. Is that a fact that small business doesn't want credit?
Good point. Let's hear from both. Lloyd, you take that first, and I'll go right back to Hector on it. Go ahead, Lloyd, real quick, and then Hector.
The NFIB surveyed their members, and their member says we want orders, not loans. The American Small Business League surveyed our members. 95% of our members want the government contracts they're supposed to get, not loans. I've got a report here from the Federal Oversight Panel slams Obama's small business plans. So it doesn't make any sense to talk about lending small businesses money when the largest federal program to direct infrastructure spending to the middle class is the Small Business Act.
Is that right, then, Hector, that, as Lloyd says, that it's not about the loans? The small businesses is not what they don't need to borrow money?
I think, look, I think you can always find examples of where some folks don't want any loans at all, and I think contracting is critically important. You're talking about $100 billion in potential contracts to small businesses. We want to make sure that they're getting their fair share of them. Look, SBA lending last year was down about 70%. It's starting to trickle back up. We need to see more of that, but I think it's a combined thing. We have to surround small businesses with all the tools they need to succeed, not just capital, not just contracts, but also capacity building. And also, the worst thing we could do is increase their cost. And a lot of them are concerned about what's going to happen with taxes next year, what's going to cost to comply with the health care legislation, what about a potential energy bill. All of those things breed uncertainty with these small businesses, and it creates, you know, an analysis paralysis, if you will. So I think we could do a lot better to create a better environment for those small businesses. And as Lloyd said, you know, small businesses still are the engine that fuels the economy. So we need to be making sure that we're paying attention to them.
Hector, that being said, what are you hearing as far as expectations from the small businesses as to whether or not they believe that we're even going to return to pre-recession levels? Do they think it's just going to stay like this for a while, and maybe we won't even see that kind of success going forward?
Well, they're very concerned, Sandra, and you know, we were expecting maybe a V-shaped recovery. Now maybe it's a U, or maybe it's a double-dip recession for a lot of small businesses. So, you know, they don't see a lot of positive things on the horizon. And I think we need to do a much better job of communicating of what's going to happen for those small businesses, how we're going to incent them, how we're going to provide them more opportunities and more resources. They're critically important to the recovery. I think we spend too much time talking about the bailouts and what big business needs and how we're going to regulate big industries, and small businesses get lip service.
I think it's interesting, Jim, that that Hector brings up the idea of a double-dip recession for small business, as opposed to one for the entire economy, which may be unlikely from a statistical point of view. GDP going negative again and heading into a double-dip recession doesn't mean maybe that some small businesses, or a number of them, would experience what feels like a double-dip recession.
Because if you look at the areas of strength in the world, it's the emerging markets and it's big business that benefits from serving them. Right. So you could have a bifurcated economy where the companies that are servicing emerging markets continue to grow, albeit modestly, and the companies that are serving the domestic market have a tough 011 for all the reasons that Hector was talking about.
Don't you think, Peter, that that's, I mean, you cover all this stuff, and you overseas cover the G20 and everything else. Don't you think that's a key point, is that a lot of multinational, big, huge companies that will be reporting their earnings in the next couple of weeks could do well because they're doing well in places like China and other emerging markets where the small businesses at home will feel like it's a double dip? Fair?
Yeah, I think that that's certainly a possibility, and the administration now, as you know, the president was out talking about these export efforts that he's trying to gin up here, and they say that they are trying to target some of those programs to small businesses so that they can participate in increased exports as well.
All right, let me wrap this up then with closing comments both from Lloyd and Hector on the outlook for the future, which we're just starting to get into a little bit anyway. But Lloyd, you first. Are things going to get better or worse in the next 6 months for small business?
I think they're going to get worse. And when you think about the Obama administration policies about small business and what he cares about small businesses, 12 investigations have showed up to $1 million a minute in federal funds that by law should go to small businesses are being diverted to some of the biggest companies in the world. And that's actually much more important than the situation with lending.
Right.
That needs to be stopped, and we need more attention on that issue.
Hector?
Well, I agree. I think we need to do much more for small businesses. The worst thing we can do is raise their taxes. They're concerned about that. They're already suffering a lot. Look, you were talking about trade very easily. Let's sign a trade agreement with Colombia. Let's sign one with Panama. Let's sign one with South Korea. Those have been on the table for a long time. Rhetoric is easy. Action is more difficult. We want to see more action.
Hector and Lloyd, thanks to both of you. Peter, great job as always. You know, this week-long series, Checks and Balances, is going to continue here, noon Eastern tomorrow. Going to speak with